Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the strangest businesses of the medieval world, collecting things that technically did not belong to you and somehow calling it devotion. Before you settle in, dim the lights, let the room get quiet, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background sound, and let us slowly walk backward through time together. Imagine Europe nearly 1,000 years ago. Roads are rough, kingdoms rise and disappear, cities compete endlessly, and people travel for weeks through forests, mountains, and muddy paths for reasons that sound unusual today. Some travel for trade, some travel for war. Some travel because they believe somewhere far away a holy object can change their lives forever. Across medieval Europe, churches and monasteries had discovered something important. People would travel extraordinary distances for sacred objects. A fragment of bone, a small piece of cloth, a tooth, a jewel said to belong to a saint. To modern eyes, it might seem strange, but to medieval people, these objects represented something larger. They were connections between earth and heaven. Miracles were believed to happen around them. Illnesses could be cured. Prayers could be answered. Protection could be given. And where pilgrims traveled, money quietly followed behind them. A remote monastery receiving a famous relic could transform almost overnight. Roads improved. Inns appeared. Merchants arrived. Donations increased. Entire towns could grow around a single sacred object resting inside a church, which meant relics were not only holy objects, they were opportunity. And whenever something becomes valuable enough, human beings begin having dangerous ideas. Somewhere in Europe, a monk looked toward another monastery and probably thought something very simple. That saint would look much better here. Of course, nobody stood up during dinner and announced, "I believe we should steal a holy object tonight." Medieval people preferred more elegant explanations. They spoke of divine purpose. They spoke of destiny. They spoke of signs from heaven. But underneath those explanations was often something much more familiar: competition. Cities competed against cities. Churches competed against churches. Monasteries competed against monasteries. Everyone wanted significance. Everyone wanted attention. Everyone wanted pilgrims walking through their doors instead of somebody else's. And slowly, quietly, across medieval Europe, strange stories began appearing. Stories of relics moving from one place to another under suspicious circumstances. Stories where saints somehow decided they preferred different homes. Stories where holy objects conveniently disappeared from one church and appeared inside another. The explanations always sounded very impressive. The saint had spoken through dreams. The saint had shown signs. The saint had performed miracles, proving where they wished to rest. The fact that someone had also carried the relic away in the middle of the night was apparently considered a minor detail. Imagine being a traveler during this period. You enter a city after weeks of walking. Massive church towers rise above rooftops. Bells echo through narrow streets. Crowds gather around market stalls. Pilgrims move through the roads, carrying bags and staffs covered in dust. And somewhere inside, the city stands a church, proudly displaying a sacred treasure, while priests explain its history with complete confidence. Maybe they tell visitors that angels protected it. Maybe they tell stories about miracles surrounding it. Maybe they describe visions and divine signs. They probably do not mention that 50 years earlier, a group of determined monks quietly borrowed it permanently from another town. Because history often becomes more elegant after enough time passes. The fascinating thing is that most people genuinely believe these stories. And perhaps that is what makes the medieval world feel so different and so familiar at the same time. People wanted meaning. They wanted certainty. They wanted to believe they stood close to something extraordinary. But people are still people no matter what century they live in. Ambition existed then, just like it exists now. Competition existed then, just like it exists now. And once power and money become involved, even devotion starts becoming complicated. Somewhere beneath candlelight in stone monasteries, plans formed quietly. Someone wrote letters. Someone watched routines. Someone waited patiently. Because some of the greatest thefts in medieval history did not involve masked figures running through darkness. They involved patient people wearing robes, speaking softly, smiling politely, and praying beside the very people they intended to rob. And that is where tonight's story really begins. The strange thing about medieval theft was that it rarely looked like theft while it was happening. Nobody wore dark masks and slipped through windows beneath moonlight. Nobody whispered dramatic lines before escaping into the night with treasure under their arm. Instead, medieval theft often arrived politely, introduced itself, stayed for dinner, and waited patiently. Somewhere in southern Europe, hidden among hills and valleys, connected by rough roads and narrow paths, monasteries sat quietly beyond city walls. At first glance, they seemed peaceful places, completely removed from ambition. Monks prayed at sunrise, copied manuscripts, worked fields, and lived lives organized around routine and devotion. Bells divided their days. Candles illuminated stone halls after sunset. Silence filled long corridors. But beneath that peaceful appearance, another reality existed, because monasteries did not simply pray. They competed. Every monastery wanted significance. Every monastery wanted influence. Every monastery wanted pilgrims arriving from distant places, carrying gifts, offerings, and stories. And pilgrims followed saints. That simple fact changed everything. If your church possessed the relics of a famous saint, people traveled unimaginable distances to visit them. Roads slowly formed around pilgrimage routes. Small villages became thriving towns. Markets expanded. Donations increased. Wealth appeared quietly and then stayed. The monks understood this perfectly. They might speak of spiritual guidance and divine purpose, but they also understood practical things. Stone buildings required repairs. Food required money. Land required protection. Monasteries survived through resources, just like every institution throughout history. So eventually someone somewhere looked toward another monastery and had a thought dangerous enough to reshape history. Perhaps the saint should live here instead. Of course, such thoughts needed careful handling, because stealing holy relics directly created uncomfortable moral questions. You could not simply walk into a monastery and announce, "We admire your saint and intend to take him with us tonight." Medieval people preferred solutions wrapped in explanations, and over time they developed one of history's most remarkable ideas. If a saint ended up somewhere new, perhaps the saint wanted to be there. The logic sounds strange today, but in the medieval mind it made surprising sense. Saints were believed to possess influence even after death. Miracles happened around their remains. They communicated through dreams and signs. If a relic moved from one church to another and blessings followed afterward, many people interpreted this not as theft, but as divine preference. Conveniently, this explanation solved nearly every problem. One of the most remarkable examples involved a remote monastery that watched pilgrims travel elsewhere year after year. Imagine the frustration. Travelers passed nearby roads but rarely stopped. Donations remained small. Attention remained elsewhere. The monks knew exactly why. They lacked a major relic. Nearby towns possessed famous saints drawing crowds from across Europe, while their own church remained relatively unnoticed. Eventually a plan formed, although calling it a plan almost feels too direct, because the strategy required extraordinary patience. Instead of rushing into another monastery and stealing a relic quickly, they chose something much slower. They sent a monk to join the rival community. He arrived respectfully. He prayed beside them, worked beside them, ate beside them. Year after year passed quietly. People trusted him completely. 10 years passed. Think about that for a moment. 10 years pretending nothing unusual was happening. 10 years waking every morning beside people he intended to betray eventually. 10 years waiting for a single opportunity. Modern theft usually values speed. Medieval theft apparently valued commitment. Finally, the opportunity arrived. The monk quietly removed the relic and returned home. That was it. Years of preparation ending in a single act. And then something remarkable happened. Nobody rushed forward screaming about robbery. Nobody launched massive investigations. Instead, stories appeared. Miracles followed. The saint, people claimed, had chosen a new home. Clearly divine will had guided events. Clearly heaven itself had directed the relocation. Pilgrims began arriving. Donations increased. Roads became busier. The monastery transformed completely. Success arrived wrapped inside holiness. And somewhere perhaps a few people privately wondered whether heaven truly worked through theft. But they probably did not ask too loudly. Because once enough people believe a story, it slowly changes shape. Eventually, it becomes history. And history often remembers winners kindly. Imagine standing among pilgrims approaching one of these monasteries centuries ago. Bells echo through cold morning air. Candles flicker behind stained windows. Crowds move toward church doors, carrying hopes, fears, prayers, illnesses, and dreams. They kneel before shrines covered in gold and jewels, while priests describe miracles performed by saints resting within. Some people cry, some pray quietly, some leave gifts, and almost nobody stops to ask whether the saint resting there actually arrived willingly. Because faith is powerful, but stories are powerful too. And in the Middle Ages, the two often walked side by side so closely that separating them became nearly impossible. The monks probably believed they were doing good. That is perhaps the strangest part. They did not think of themselves as criminals hiding stolen objects beneath floorboards. They believed they were guardians bringing saints somewhere better. They believed miracles justified actions. They believed success itself proved divine approval. Human beings have always possessed a remarkable ability to explain complicated choices in ways that allow them to sleep peacefully afterward. Medieval Europe simply did it with saints and relics instead of modern language and paperwork. And while all of this unfolded quietly inside monasteries and churches, something else was beginning far away beyond coastlines and northern seas. Because elsewhere, men were climbing aboard ships with entirely different ideas about ownership. And unlike patient monks who waited years, these men preferred arriving quickly with axes in hand. Far to the north, beyond the comfortable borders of kingdoms and monasteries, beyond the stone churches and quiet fields of Europe, another world existed entirely. It was colder there, The seas were rougher. Winters felt longer. Villages clung to coastlines where mountains met water and where survival itself often depended on strength, skill, and opportunity. And somewhere along those northern shores, men stood beside long wooden ships, watching waves strike against rocks while hearing stories about lands to the south. Stories of rich monasteries. Stories of churches covered in silver and gold. Stories of sacred places filled with treasures, protected not by soldiers, but by monks carrying books and prayers. To northern raiders, these stories probably sounded less like religious descriptions and more like directions, because wealth was wealth, regardless of whether someone called it holy. Then one morning, strange shapes appeared on distant water. Long, narrow ships moved toward the coast like dark shadows rising from the sea itself. Their dragon-shaped prows cut through waves while sails carried them steadily forward. For people living inside monasteries, there was often very little warning. A fisherman might notice them first. Someone working nearby fields might stop and stare toward the horizon. Bells might ring an alarm. But by then, time was already disappearing quickly. Imagine the scene. Monks rush through stone corridors while confusion spreads around them. Voices echo through halls usually filled with silence. Sacred objects are gathered desperately. Candles shake in nervous hands. Outside, ships reach shore and armed figures begin moving toward land. And then panic replaces order completely, because these visitors had not crossed dangerous seas to admire architecture. They had arrived for treasure. Monasteries made perfect targets. They possessed beautiful objects accumulated over centuries. Gold chalices rested on altars. Silver crosses reflected candlelight. Decorative reliquaries covered in jewels protected sacred remains. Manuscripts contained elaborate artwork created by hands that spent years adding detail after detail across pages. To monks, these objects represented devotion and faith. To raiders, they represented portable wealth. And portable wealth was difficult to ignore. What makes this fascinating is that the raiders often cared very little about artistic importance. They cared about materials. Gold could become coins. Silver could be traded. Jewels could be removed and reused. Religious meaning mattered far less than practical value. Imagine someone spending months creating a beautiful sacred object only for another person to arrive and immediately think, interesting amount of silver. History can be surprisingly brutal that way. Some objects disappeared forever. Gold was melted down. Decorations removed. Sacred treasures broken apart and transformed into something else entirely. Yet strangely enough, some things survived precisely because the raiders ignored them. Manuscripts often escaped destruction because books written in Latin looked less valuable than shining metal. Imagine that strange irony. Pages of extraordinary art and knowledge survived because someone thought they looked boring. History sometimes survives through accidents rather than protection. Years passed and stories spread across Europe. Monasteries whispered about northern raiders arriving suddenly from the sea. Fear traveled faster than ships. Some communities began hiding treasures. Others moved sacred objects inland, hoping distance would provide safety. Monks buried valuables beneath churches and inside walls. Important relics disappeared before raids arrived. Entire communities began preparing for danger before danger appeared. And this created another strange effect. Because once people start hiding treasures, moving treasures, and protecting treasures, they also start noticing how valuable those treasures truly are. A church carrying relics away from danger might discover a new location attracting pilgrims. A monastery protecting sacred objects elsewhere might accidentally create a new center of attention. In trying to prevent loss, they sometimes created opportunity. Human beings have always done this. We move something to protect it and eventually discover we have changed its meaning entirely. Somewhere during those years, a monk carrying a sacred object across rough roads may have looked around and wondered whether they were rescuing a treasure or relocating history itself. Because once something moves, everything around it changes too. Villages grow where none existed before. Roads appear where nobody traveled previously. Stories change shape. Power shifts quietly. And while raiders from the north probably never intended to reshape medieval Europe beyond gathering wealth, their actions sent waves across history, reaching far beyond coastlines. Because fear changes behavior, movement changes history, and sometimes the things people save become even more powerful than the things that were stolen. As the centuries moved forward, Europe slowly changed around these stories, but something interesting happened. The thefts never truly stopped. The methods changed. The explanations became more sophisticated. The people involved wore different clothing and spoke different languages. But the ideas underneath remained surprisingly familiar, because by now medieval Europe had learned something important. Relics, sacred objects, and works of art possessed a strange kind of power. They did more than sit quietly inside churches. They attracted people. They created identity. They turned unknown places into destinations. Entire cities could reshape themselves around a single object resting behind stone walls. And once people understand that something carries power, they begin finding reasons to possess it. Imagine entering a medieval city late in the afternoon. The sky above glows orange as sunlight touches towers and rooftops. Bells echo through streets filled with merchants closing stalls and travelers searching for places to sleep. The air carries smoke from fires and distant voices mixing together beneath cathedral walls. Above everything rises an enormous church dominating the city itself. Pilgrims continue arriving even as evening approaches because they have traveled for weeks, sometimes months, to stand before something they believe is extraordinary. Some have crossed mountains. Some have walked through storms. Some have spent their life savings reaching this destination. And all because inside that church rests a relic, a fragment of bone, a sacred object, or a treasure connected to someone believed to stand closer to heaven than ordinary people. The fascinating thing is that many visitors probably never questioned how these objects arrived there in the first place. They saw miracles, devotion, and meaning. They saw the final result rather than the complicated journey behind it. Because history often hides its fingerprints after enough time passes. A relic stolen generations earlier no longer looked stolen. It looked established. It looked natural. It belonged there because people had grown up believing it belonged there. Children heard stories from parents. Parents heard stories from priests. The object became part of identity itself. And identity has a way of rewriting memory. Somewhere beneath magnificent churches and beautiful stories rested quieter truths. Monks who waited years before taking something. Sailors who arrived claiming rescue while carrying away treasure. Armies entering cities and leaving with priceless works of art. People convincing themselves that difficult choices served noble purposes. Yet perhaps judging them too quickly misses something important. Medieval people lived in a world very different from ours. Their understanding of faith, miracles, and divine purpose shaped every decision they made. To them, saints were not distant historical figures. Saints were active presences influencing everyday life. If miracles happened after relocating a relic, many saw that as proof rather than coincidence. If prosperity followed, they saw blessing rather than strategy. The line separating devotion, ambition, and necessity rarely stood clearly apart. They overlapped constantly, and perhaps that is why these stories remain fascinating centuries later. Because underneath the medieval details, underneath the relics in monasteries and candlelight, the people themselves feel surprisingly familiar. Human beings still compete. Human beings still want significance. Cities still want recognition. Institutions still want influence.